I saw things. True cemetery worker stories that will keep you awake. Have you ever driven past a cemetery at night and felt that chill down your spine? That feeling that something is there watching, waiting? Now imagine working there, alone, at 3 in the morning, when the only sound you hear is your own footsteps on the gravel, and then you hear others. That's right. Some people do this every day. My name is Nick, and I spend too much time thinking about cemetery workers and what they see when no one else is around. About the things that happen in the places where we keep our dead. About what remains waiting when everyone else leaves. If you're someone who enjoys real cemetery stories, click the subscribe button and leave a like if this video keeps you awake tonight. Because listen, after this story, you're going to start seeing cemeteries in a completely different way. The thing is, we live in a society that treats death as something distant, something that only happens to others. We pass by cemeteries, see the headstones, the flowers, but we never stop to think. Someone works there. Someone takes care of that place. Someone stays there when the sun goes down. And that's where things get interesting. Because what I'm going to tell you today is not an urban legend. It's not a scary fairy tale that someone invented to frighten you. It's the real story of a man named Roberto Mendes, a gravedigger who worked for 17 years at the Cemitério de Consolação, Consolation Cemetery, in Sao Paulo. 17 years digging graves, closing coffins, walking among the dead. And during those 17 years, Roberto saw things. Things that made him question everything he believed about life, death, and what comes after. Now you might be thinking, Nick, cemetery workers always have stories to tell. It's part of the job, right? And look, you're not wrong. But this story is different. Because on March 14, 2003, Roberto Mendes stopped working. He simply quit everything. After 17 years doing the same job, he walked into the cemetery administrator's office at 7 in the morning, left his keys on the desk, and said only one sentence. I can't be near her anymore. And he never returned. So who was Roberto Mendes? Roberto was not a superstitious guy. Quite the opposite. He was known among his colleagues as Beto Atu, Beto the atheist, a nickname he didn't mind carrying. While the other grave diggers said their prayers before descending into a grave, while they made the sign of the cross when passing certain tombs, Roberto would laugh. A dead person is a dead person, he used to say. There's nothing here but bones and dirt. He had started working at the cemetery in 1986, at just 22 years old. At the time, Sao Paulo was growing fast, and there was no shortage of work at the cemetery. Roberto needed money, he had just gotten married, and the job paid well for someone who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty. And Roberto? He wasn't afraid. In the first years he mostly worked during the day. Opening graves, preparing plots for funerals, maintenance. Hard work but honest, and Roberto was good at what he did. Efficient. He never complained. But here's what most people don't realize about cemeteries. The work never stops. People die in the middle of the night. People die early in the morning. And someone has to be there to prepare everything before the funeral. Someone has to work the night shift. In 1994, Roberto started working on Friday nights. From 10 at night to 6 in the morning. The pay was better, almost double the normal shift. And for a guy who didn't believe in ghosts, in souls, in any of that, it was easy money. During the first few months, nothing extraordinary happened. Roberto dug his graves under the light of the cemetery street lamps, listened to music on his portable radio, and smoked his cigarettes. Sometimes he saw stray cats. Sometimes he heard the wind rustling the trees. Normal. But then came September 1994. And that's when Roberto met grave 1.847, Sector D. It was a Friday, September 16th. Roberto remembers the date because it was his daughter's birthday. She was turning 5. He had promised to leave early, but the hospital had called, warning that a body was on its way. He needed to prepare the grave that night for the funeral on Saturday morning. The grave was in Sector D, one of the oldest areas of the cemetery. Huge trees, cracked marble headstones, that smell of damp earth and rotten leaves. Roberto didn't really like working there, not out of fear but because the ground was tougher, full of roots. The order was clear: grave 1.847. 3 meters deep. Roberto parked his tool cart near the site, turned on the portable spotlights and began to dig. The soil was strangely soft, which was good. It meant the job would be quicker. He could finish in 3-4 hours and get home in time to see his daughter before she went to sleep. But when his shovel hit something solid about 1.5 meters down, Roberto stopped. There shouldn't have been anything there. He bent down, cleared the dirt with his hands and felt something cold. Smooth. Like varnished wood. A coffin. Now look, this happens. Old cemeteries sometimes have inaccurate records. Sometimes someone is buried in the wrong place. Sometimes the maps don't match. Roberto had encountered this before. It wasn't exactly common, but it wasn't impossible either. The protocol was simple. Stop the work, inform the administrator, check the records, decide what to do. But it was midnight on a Friday. The administrator wouldn't be there until Monday. The funeral was Saturday morning. And Roberto wanted to go home. So he made a decision. I'll just take a look. He cleared more dirt around the coffin. It was old. You could tell by the discolored wood, the rusty metal fittings. It had to be at least 40-50 years old. Maybe more. And then Roberto saw the bronze plaque. Even covered in dirt and verdigris, he could read it. Helena Araújo Costa. 1891 to 1932. Esperei em vão. I waited in vain. I waited in vain. What a strange epitaph, Roberto thought. But what caught his attention most was the date, 1932. That coffin had been there for over 60 years. Technically, long enough to be considered abandoned, according to the cemetery rules. Roberto knew what he had to do. He should report it, wait, follow protocol. And here's where he made his mistake. Roberto decided he could simply dig alongside it. Divert about 50 centimeters to the left, and make the new grave right there next to it. Problem solved. No one needed to know. So that's what he did. 2 hours later, the new grave was ready. Roberto was tired, sweaty, but satisfied. Job done. He could go home. But as he started gathering his tools, as he turned off the spotlights and the darkness enveloped everything around him, that's when he heard it. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like fingernails scratching wood, coming from beneath the earth, from where the coffin of Helena Araújo Costa was. Roberto froze. Rats, he thought immediately. It has to be rats, or roots moving in the wind. But the sound didn't stop. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Rhythmic, persistent. And then it stopped. Total silence. Roberto forced a laugh, shook his head. You're going crazy, Beto, he muttered to himself. Too old for this job. He picked up his things, got into the cart, and drove away. But the truth? That sound stayed with him. All night long. When he got home, when he lay in bed, when he closed his eyes, he heard that scritch, scritch, scritch echoing in his head. Now you might be thinking, Nick, that's just paranoia. The guy works in a cemetery at night. It's obvious his imagination is going to play tricks. And look, I would agree with you. I really would. If it weren't for what happened the following week. Friday, September 23rd. Roberto returned for the night shift. He had convinced himself that the sound had been imagination, fatigue, anything. He was determined not to let it affect him. That night's job was general maintenance. Fixing fences, cleaning walkways, trimming grass around some old graves. Light work. Quiet work. But when Roberto entered the cemetery at 10 o'clock that night, he felt something different. Tension in the air. As if the place was waiting for something. He started in Sector A, far from Sector D. Far from grave 1.847. But all the time he felt as if something was pulling him in that direction. A morbid curiosity. I need to check. Just to be sure, he thought. Just to prove that nothing is wrong. At 12:40 in the morning, Roberto was back in Sector D. The two graves were there, the new one he had dug, already filled after the Saturday funeral, and next to it, slightly visible under a thin layer of earth, the top of Helena's coffin. Everything seemed normal, quiet, peaceful. Roberto was about to leave when he noticed something strange. The earth on top of Helena's coffin was moved. Not much, but enough to be noticeable, as if someone had dug there, or as if something had dug its way out from the inside. Roberto's heart raced. He approached slowly, knelt, and touched the dirt. It was loose, fresh, as if it had been recently turned over. And then he saw it, cracked, on top of the coffin. A thin, irregular line running across the old wood from one side to the other. It definitely hadn't been there last week. Roberto was sure. He had seen that coffin. It was whole. Now it was cracked. Oh. Roberto was bending down to examine it more closely when he heard a sound behind him. Footsteps. On the gravel. He spun around quickly. Nothing. Sector D was empty. Just him and the silent graves. But Roberto had heard something. He was sure. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice sounding weaker than he would have liked. No answer. Only the wind in the trees. And that heavy, damn silence that seemed to suck all sound out of the world. Roberto decided enough was enough. He went back to the office, locked the door, and spent the rest of the night inside, drinking coffee and avoiding looking at the windows. Because he had the feeling, irrational, absurd but real, that if he looked outside he would see something looking back. In the following days Roberto tried to forget. He tried to convince himself that the crack had been there all along and he just hadn't noticed. That the footsteps were an animal. That everything had a logical explanation. But Tuesday morning when he got home after his regular shift, he did something he had never done before. He went to the library. Roberto was not a man of books. But he needed to know. He needed to understand who Helena Araújo Costa was and why she had been buried with those words, "I waited in vain." It took 3 hours of research in the old newspaper archives, but Roberto finally found it. An article from 1932. Small, hidden on page 6. Woman dies after waiting for fiancé who never returned. The story was simple and tragic. Helena Araújo Costa, 41, had gotten engaged in 1914 to a man named João Pedro Almeida. But before the wedding, João was drafted for the First World War. Brazil had sent troops, and João was a military doctor. He promised to return. Promised that as soon as the war ended, they would marry. Helena waited, and waited, and waited. The war ended in 1918. João never returned. No news, no letter, no body. He simply disappeared. Helena spent the next 14 years waiting, refusing other suitors, always wearing the engagement ring, keeping the house ready for his return. And on August 12, 1932, Helena was found dead in her home. The official cause was cardiac arrest. But the neighbors told the newspaper another story. A story of a woman who had simply given up on life, who had spent her last days murmuring João's name, looking out the window, waiting for a man who would never come. Her family chose the epitaph, "I waited in vain," a bitter reminder of a life wasted waiting for something that never happened. Roberto closed the old newspaper, feeling a heaviness in his chest. He remembered the crack in the coffin, the scratches, the footsteps. And for the first time in 17 years of working with the dead, Roberto Mendes felt fear. Here is where it gets truly interesting. Because what happened in the following weeks was not an isolated experience. It wasn't one strange night that Roberto could dismiss. It was a sequence of events, each more disturbing than the last. Friday, September 30th. Roberto was avoiding Sector D completely. He had even asked the supervisor to change his area, said the old trees were causing him back problems, that he needed to work on flatter ground. The request was denied. Staff shortage. So that night, Roberto once again found himself preparing a grave in Sector D. Grave 1.853. 6 plots away from Helena's. He worked fast. He wanted to finish and get out of there as quickly as possible. But at 2 in the morning, when he stopped for a drink of water, he felt it. That stare. You know what I'm talking about. That physical sensation that someone is watching you. The hairs on the back of your neck standing up. The primitive instinct screaming, danger. Roberto turned slowly, and he saw her. At first he thought it was fog. Sector D was always damp, always misty at night. But this mist was different. It had a form, an outline, a figure of a woman, standing between 2 graves, about 20 meters away, completely motionless, dressed in white. Roberto's blood turned to ice. Is someone there? He called out, his voice cracking. The cemetery is closed. You can't be here. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. She just stood there watching. Roberto took a step toward her, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. Hey, I'm talking to you. And then the figure moved. She didn't walk. She didn't run. She simply glided, as if on invisible skates. Smoothly and silently, she moved between the graves, heading deeper into Sector D, toward grave 1.847. Roberto didn't think. His body reacted instinctively. He dropped the shovel and ran. Not after the figure, away from her. He ran to the office, locked the door, and stayed there, trembling until the sun rose. When the supervisor arrived at 6 in the morning and found Roberto huddled in a chair, pale and sweating, the first thing he asked was, "Beto, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Roberto couldn't answer, because he had. And for the first time in his life, Roberto Mendes, Beto the atheist, the man who laughed at the dead, believed. Roberto took a week off. He said he had the flu. But the truth was he was scared. Scared to go back. Scared of what he had seen. But money didn't last forever. And after 7 days at home watching his savings dwindle, Roberto knew he had to return. But first he needed answers. He went back to the library. This time he looked deeper. Cemetery records. Old documents. Anything about Helena Araújo Costa and grave 1.847. And that's when he found something that changed everything. A report from 1945, 13 years after Helena's death. A cemetery investigation after several families complained about vandalism in Sector D graves. According to the report, several plots had been disturbed, turned over soil, moved headstones, and in one of the graves, 1.847, the coffin had been found partially unearthed. Inside the coffin, investigators found something that shouldn't have been there. Marks, scratches, on the inside of the lid. The report concluded that it was likely damage caused by time, rotting wood, insects. But there was a footnote. A small, almost forgotten note. Witness JM reports hearing sounds emanating from the grave on the nights of August 12th and 13th, the anniversary of the death. Investigation did not confirm abnormal findings. Roberto felt his stomach churn. August 12th and 13th, the anniversary of Helena's death. He checked the calendar. Today was October 11th. 10 months until the next anniversary. But then Roberto noticed something else. Something that chilled him to the bone. The dates he had seen the figure, heard the sounds, and the crack had appeared, they were all Fridays. Helena had died on a Friday. And her fiancé João Pedro Almeida had promised to return on a Friday. She's still waiting, Roberto thought, horror overwhelming him. Every Friday she's still waiting for him to come back. Roberto returned to work on Monday. But he did something no one expected. He went to talk to the cemetery priest, Father Miguel, an old man who celebrated masses in the chapel. Roberto told him everything. Every detail. Expecting to be ridiculed, expecting to be called crazy. But Father Miguel just listened. And when Roberto finished, the priest sighed deeply. "I know about that grave," he said, his voice tired. "There have been stories about it for decades. Workers who refuse to go near it. Visitors who report strange sensations. I myself have prayed there many times trying to bring peace. And did it work? Roberto asked, desperate. The priest shook his head. Some souls don't want peace, Roberto. They want what was promised to them. So what do I do? The priest thought for a long moment. There is one thing, a story I heard when I was young. About Helena and João. What story? That João didn't die in the war. He returned. In 1920. 8 years after the war ended. Roberto was shocked. But the newspaper said he disappeared. He disappeared because he didn't go back to Helena. João had married another woman in Europe. When he returned to Brazil, he simply started a new life. In another city. With another name. The betrayal. The cruelty. Helena had waited for a man who chose not to return. How do you know this? Roberto asked. Because João Pedro Almeida is buried here. In this very cemetery. He died in 1958. Sector F, grave 2.284. Roberto felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. There, here. In the same cemetery? 30 meters away from each other, the priest confirmed. And she never knew. She died waiting for a man who was only a half-hour walk away, living his life with someone else. Friday, November 3rd. Roberto had a plan. An insane, desperate plan, but a plan. He arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual. At 9 at night. And instead of starting his normal work, he went straight to Sector F. Grave 2.284. João Pedro Almeida. 1892 to 1958. Paz. In peace. In peace. What an irony. Roberto dug. Not the whole grave, just enough to reach the coffin. Just enough to do what he needed to do. When he exposed the coffin lid, he placed something on it. Something he had brought from home. A letter. He had written it by hand in his best handwriting. Helena, João is here. He came back. He was always here. You don't have to wait anymore. You can rest now. Roberto didn't know if this would make any difference. Probably not. It was probably the stupidest thing he had ever done. But he had to try. He buried the letter there on João's coffin and replaced the earth. Then, with his heart pounding, he walked back to Sector D. To grave 1.847. The night was cold. Colder than usual. Roberto could see his breath condensing in the air. He stood before Helena's grave, his hands trembling. Helena, he said aloud, feeling ridiculous but also terrified. I know you're there. I know you can hear me. The wind stopped. Completely. It was as if the whole world had held its breath. João is here. In the cemetery. He always was. And I'm so sorry. I'm sorry no one told you. I'm sorry you waited for so long. Nothing. Absolute silence. Roberto was about to leave when he saw her. The figure in white. This time she was closer. Only 5 meters away. Roberto could see details now, the antique dress, the veil, the pale face. And the eyes. God, the eyes. Empty. Like bottomless pits of sorrow. Helena? Roberto whispered. The figure tilted her head as if studying him. And then for the first time she spoke. The voice was faint, distant, like wind through dry leaves. He returned? Roberto felt tears burning his eyes. Yes, he returned. Did he come for me? And there was the lie Roberto had to tell. The merciful lie. Yes, he's waiting for you. He's always been waiting. The figure stood still for a long moment. And then something changed. The tension in the air lessened. The temperature returned to normal. And the figure smiled. It was the saddest smile Roberto had ever seen. Finally, she whispered, and she disappeared. Not gradually. Not dissolving. She simply ceased to be there. Roberto fell to his knees, sobbing, not understanding why he was crying but unable to stop. Roberto returned to work normally in the following weeks. Sector D was different, lighter, quieter. He never saw the figure in white again. Never heard the scratches again. The crack on Helena's coffin seemed to have stopped growing. But something happened that Roberto never expected. In January 2003, a woman appeared at the cemetery. An old woman, almost 90, leaning on a cane. She was João Pedro Almeida's granddaughter. She had come to the cemetery because she'd had a dream. A dream where a woman in white was standing next to her grandfather's grave, smiling. The woman didn't know who the figure in the dream was, but she felt she needed to come to the cemetery. And when she saw Helena's grave, when she read the name, the date, the epitaph, she started to cry. Because her grandmother João's wife had told her on her deathbed about the other woman, about Helena, about how João carried the guilt all his life, about how he never forgave himself for not returning. João's granddaughter did something her family had never done. She apologized. There, before Helena's grave, a woman of almost 90 apologized on behalf of a man who had been dead for decades. And then she did one more thing. She had a new plaque installed. Right next to Helena's epitaph. The new plaque read, "He missed you." It wasn't true. Not entirely. But it was a bit of peace. A bit of closure. And when Roberto saw that plaque, he knew he had done the right thing. But the story doesn't end there. Because in March 2003, Roberto was doing his normal shift, this time during the day, when he passed by Sector D. And he saw something that made him stop. On Helena's grave there were fresh flowers. Flowers that no one had placed. No visitor had come. No family was registered. But the flowers were there. White roses. Fresh as if they had been placed that morning. And next to them on the ground were footprints in the dew. 2 sets of footprints. A pair of women's shoes. Small. Delicate. And a pair of men's shoes. Larger. Heavier. The footprints came from the direction of João's grave and ended at Helena's. And then they simply disappeared. It was at that moment that Roberto decided he had to leave. Not because he was afraid. Not because something bad had happened. Roberto stood before those footprints for almost half an hour. Just looking. Trying to process what he was seeing. He bent down, touched the damp earth where the marks ended. The grass was pressed down as if someone had really walked there. But the footprints simply ceased. As if the 2 people had taken one last step and then dissolved into the air. Together, Roberto thought. They are finally together. And it was in that moment that Roberto understood something that would change him forever. For 17 years he had worked surrounded by death. He had dug hundreds of graves. He had buried hundreds of bodies. And all that time he had believed that dead was dead. That there was nothing but bones and dirt. But Helena had proven him wrong. Not about death, about what remains afterwards. Not ghosts. Not hauntings. But something deeper. More real. Unrequited love. Unkept promises. Hopes that refused to die. Helena wasn't haunting the cemetery because she was evil or vengeful. She was there because her love, true, pure, devastating, was too strong to simply end. She had waited so long in life that she continued waiting in death. Until finally, by some miracle or mercy of the universe, she had found what she was looking for. Roberto walked into the administrator's office at 7 in the morning on March 14, 2003. He placed the keys on the desk and said, "I can't be near her anymore." The administrator frowned. Near who, Beto? Roberto couldn't explain. How do you explain that you witnessed something impossible? That you saw love transcend death itself? That you carried the weight of a woman's sorrow, dead for 70 years? "I just can't anymore," he said simply. And he left. Roberto Mendes never returned to the Cemitério de Consolação. He got a job at a mechanic's shop, working with things that made sense, things he could fix, things that were solid and real. But he never forgot Helena. Sometimes on Friday nights he would suddenly wake up hearing that sound, scritch, 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 and he would lie there in the dark, remembering. Years later, in 2019, a journalist doing a story about historical cemeteries in Sao Paulo interviewed Roberto. At the end of the conversation, the journalist asked, "Do you regret working there?" Seeing what you saw. Roberto was silent for a long time. No, he finally replied. Because she taught me something important. What? That the scariest thing in the world isn't the dead. It's dying without having lived enough. It's waiting for something that never comes. It's carrying love that was never returned. He looked out the window, lost in thought. Helena wasn't trapped in the cemetery because of death. She was trapped because of the life she never had. And that is more terrifying than any ghost. Today, if you visit the Cemiterio de Consolação, you will find graves 1.847 and 2.284 still there. They are silent now, peaceful. Once in a while, visitors report feeling a warm presence in Sector D. Not terrifying, not frightening, just complete. As if two souls who searched for each other for decades had finally met. And on the mornings after Fridays, a bouquet of white roses sometimes appears on Helena's grave. No one knows who leaves them. There are no cameras in that area. No visitor records. But the flowers keep appearing. Fresh, perfect, eternal. Like a love that refused to die. So, what do you think? A true story or just a well-told urban legend? The truth is that Roberto Mendes is real. The Cemiterio de Consolação is real. And somewhere in that cemetery, there are graves with stories we will never fully know. Because the dead keep their secrets. But sometimes, just sometimes, they let us glimpse the truth. And Helena's truth is not about ghosts or hauntings. It's about the price of waiting. The burden of unreturned love. And the devastating power of an unfulfilled promise. Next time you pass a cemetery, think about that. Think about the stories buried there. The lives that ended too soon, the loves that were never realized, the hopes that died with the bodies. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why Roberto Mendes never wanted to go back. Because some stories are too heavy to carry. Some sorrows are too deep to witness. And some souls deserve more than death gave them. If this story made you think, if it made you look at death differently, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you believe that love can transcend death? Or was Helena just a lost soul, trapped by her own pain? I'm Nick, and this was the story of Helena Araújo Costa. The woman who waited so long that not even death could make her stop. Until the next story. And remember, the dead are not what we should fear. It's dying without having truly lived.